Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Victoria Mattingly, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the SIOP Conversation Series podcast, where we talk with leading industrial organizational psychologists and affiliates. And today is episode number 41, where we'll be talking about the science behind navigating today's uncertain workplace. A quick note, the views and opinions expressed in today's conversation series are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of SIOP. Today, our guest discusses one of the top 10 trending topics in the field of IO, which is revisiting people strategies in times of economic uncertainty. Welcome to the SIOP Conversation Series podcast, David Le Mentec.
Hello, Victoria. It's great to be here.
Great to have you here, even though I would so rather be in that nice looking pool right now, but I digress.
I wish he was home.
Yeah. But a little bit about you, David, I just want to share with our audience. David's actually not an IO psychologist, but a SIOP affiliate member, which I love that we've opened up that pool to, it just welcome and gain community with those who aren't technically IO psychologists but has such to gain from our field and vice versa. So I'm super excited to talk about that. But David has spent the last 20 plus years really committed to the professionalization of HR, which I love, and rigorous talent development. David is an L&D architect, so a learning and development architect who brings his experience in organizational development to the top level of multinational organizations. So David has had quite the career journey, especially alongside big companies and IOs and all these big clients that a lot of IOs work at. So one being DDI, Development Dimensions International, where he was talent advisor and strategic account manager. We did overlap. No, we didn't overlap at DDI. But I was there in 2016. I was there 2016 and 2018.
Oh.
So I'm excited to talk about your experience there. I'm still in Pittsburgh because DDI brought me back to Pittsburgh. And I was born and raised here, but I digress. Okay, you are also at Personnel Decisions International, PDI, as a director of client solutions. David also advised the Swarovski family. Now, is that the diamond company? Interesting. As their global head of leadership development, and he contributed to leadership development initiatives at several academic institutions, including the University of St Gallen and Zurich University of Applied Sciences. So French and now Swiss. David holds an MA in International Business from ESC Rennes School of Business in France and Concordia University in Canada. So quite the world traveler. I'm so excited to hear about from your global perspective, because honestly, most of our guests come from the States. And so it's great to have someone who's coming in evening time. So we're 6-hour time difference. So I'm grateful that you're willing to share some of your evening with us, especially knowing you're there with your wife and your 15-year-old twin girls. And in David's spare time, he's a music fan. I share that with you, David. And currently preparing a book, this is fascinating, on an Ethiopian pianist and nun who had an epiphany in Switzerland some 100 years ago. So it was the Ethiopian pianist is a nun. It's the same person.
Correct.
Interesting. Oh my gosh. Okay. So all that is to say, David, quite the background. I'm just so happy that you're here to join us today and just share some of what you do with our audience. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Victoria, for that great introduction. It's just great to be here with the SIOP community.
Yeah, absolutely. So, even though you might not be an IO psychologist by trade, you do have extensive experience in the field. And so can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with SIOP as a non-IO psychologist?
Sure. I guess the short answer to that, Victoria, would be I got involved through the generosity and open-mindedness of Michelle Goro from the SIOP membership chair and members of that chair of that committee. But let me perhaps rewind a little bit. I think I first heard of the SIOP term, and at the time I didn't know exactly what it meant, when I joined, as you mentioned, an organization called DDI, Development Dimensions International. That was probably a little bit over 20 years ago now. And later, so there and later with at PDI, Personal Decisions International, those are the two organizations where I got the opportunity to work and really enjoy and appreciate the intellectual rigor that industrial and organizational psychologists bring to the profession of HR. People like Bill Byam, for example, the founder of DDI, people like David Peterson. I've worked on the legacy of his work at PDI. I actually realized in preparing this podcast today that David passed away earlier this spring, which is such an immense loss for the profession, for everybody on the podcast today who knew David and the work, the contribution that he's made in the work in the world of coaching, particularly. It's such an immense loss. So I want to pay tribute to him today. I often hear that, business strategy, I come from the business world, right? From a business background. And I often hear that, business strategy is the hard thing to do, strategic consulting, where do we go? Where do we invest and divest? I actually found from my experience that the execution of the strategy, so the people dimension, was actually the most challenging and the most complex thing. And this is also what I've heard from many CEOs and executives. And so I had the opportunity to experience, to collaborate with IO psychologists and experience this uniquely powerful combination of the intellectual rigor of industrial organizational psychologists and business, to support clients with their topic. And so that's how I decided to, I became more curious about SIOP. And a couple of years ago now, I decided to actually engage more actively with SIOP. And then I sort of hit a wall because, again, as I come from the business world, how am I going to actually, contribute to and enter an organization, a community that I shouldn't be a part of, essentially, with a business degree? And so I don't know if you recall maybe the movie Shawshank Redemption, right? There's this moment where Andy Dufresne starts to write to the state senate to ask for books, right? And he sends a letter a week and then more and more. And it was a bit about that. I wrote a note to SIOP every year suggesting, an opportunity to contribute, right? And so this is how I actually became an affiliate, which, it's interesting because the topic that, this trend 7 that I'm working on right now, we'll have the fourth quarter review coming up in about a month. It talks about, how we should reconsider people's strategies in time of uncertainty. And I want to talk a bit about that in the context of SIOP, because I think every ecosystem, in times of uncertainty, rapid, accelerated change, has an opportunity to either erect walls or build bridges. And I'm simply super grateful for SIOP to have chosen the latter, right? To have this open circulation of ideas, which I think is a people strategy that a lot of organizations could think about, right? There's a risk, a tendency in times of uncertainty and doubt to sort of, be entrenched internally. And I think maintaining a view on the external world, looking outside, is often it's going to be more enriching for an organization. And so I was super pleased when SIOP welcomed me, and I've just been learning so much from the SIOP community already. So just been great. So that's a bit about how
that. I love that. Okay, so can I give you an insider tip, David?
Please.
Okay, so now that you're part of our community, we like to call it SIOP. So not SIOP, just SIOP.
See, I didn't know what I was talking about.
I know now, but now you're an insider. So now you know the lingo. And it's interesting because we've had a lot of, there's been a lot of history around not just the name of SIOP, but the name of industrial organizational psychology, because David, no profession should take 10 syllables to say. No profession. Whenever I tell people I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, their eyes glaze over by syllable 6, right? And so I personally have dropped the industrial part. I like on my email signature, LinkedIn, how I talk about myself and talks I give or whatnot. I'm just an organizational psychologist. The industrial part confuses people. And so relating back to SIOP, there's been this my advisor and mentor, Kurt Krager, who was a past SIOP president, he's told me some of the insider scoop about this, but they'll be on the ballot every so years. So should we drop the industrial? Should we just be the Society of Organizational Psychology? Or maybe the Society of Workplace Psychology? Who knows? Should we change our name is the question. And everyone just says no, ultimately, because we don't want to be SOP, S-O-P. We don't want to be SOP. We want to be SIOP. We don't want to be SOP. And I get it, SOP, soppy clothes. I don't know, but it's just so funny. So yeah, now you're an insider. It's SIOP.
All right.
And so I had a couple follow-up questions. First off, you said that you would write letters every year to SIOP asking to get involved. How long did you do that letter campaign?
So that's what Andy Dufresne did in the movie. I didn't write letters. I sent an email an email or two a year for about 2 or 3 years, I think. So that's maybe 6 in total. So
okay. And so where did your letter go to? And did it eventually get to Michelle Goro? Or how did that connection happen?
I think I initially connected with the membership committee at first, or the membership chair, and got an open response. That SIOP would consider it, and then I actually followed up, and I think it was end of last year, about a year ago, that I got this acceptance email from Michelle Goro, and so that's how the collaboration started.
What a beautiful story. I'm a big proponent of if you don't ask, the answer is always no. And I've crafted internships for myself, different job roles or projects or assignments, just by asking, gotten connected. We just got asked, a partner company just gave us their vendor list for a conference we're going to, so you could invite people to our party, right? It's just things that you don't think people would share with you or do for you. And then you just ask, and someday it happens. What a beautiful story. So thank you for asking. I fully agree with what you said. And I applaud SIOP as well for building, as you said, bridges and not walls. And you said a phrase like this, looking outside, and how can we share our diverse perspectives and the different frames on this space? Because as you said, you're coming from a talent, from a business standpoint. We're coming from it from an organizational science standpoint, from a people standpoint. And we're still trying to solve the same problems. But as you said, the intellectual vigor that IO brings to the field, I love that. I +1 all of it. I'm super thrilled to have you and other affiliate members to be part of SIOP now, so we can learn from each other. Do you plan on coming to the conference? I know that's more of a haul from where you are, but what is that a possibility for you?
Potentially in the future, yes. I would love to be more involved. So I'll consider future conferences for sure.
Excellent. It's Chicago in April of 2024, if you want to put it on your calendar.
All right.
Okay, so can you elaborate on like what drew you to HR and talent development? And I don't know if this is a related question, David, or maybe it's a second question, but L&D architect. I was like a straight up like learning and development, like scientist, glorified instructional designer, quite honestly, in a few of my previous consulting roles, and in some of the work I currently do. Like we still build some webinars, workshops, different things, in my current position. And so what does it mean to be an L&D architect? I think I was one. I love that term. I think it's a great term. And so what drew you to this HR, talent development, L&D architect field that you've now ended up in,
So I'll start with the first part of your question on what drew me to the profession, and then I'll talk a bit about the actual term of L&D architect and what that entails. As I mentioned, I graduated with a business degree back in I think it was 99, and at my business school, nature versus nurture, I don't know, right? But you can probably only nurture nature in some way. But I got more and more curious about the people dimension of the business, And I got to pay tribute to one individual in particular who was a teacher in my change management class, must have been in 97 or 98. His name is Dr. Jonathan Mattingly. He's now at Monash Business School in Australia. Is not only a professor, but also a great friend by now. And I think Jonathan in his class had the ability to create a space where the students were kind of allowed to ask, I'd say, deeper questions about the business world and organizations overall. So, what are some of the mental construct or the beliefs of an organization, right? And to what extent some of these organizational beliefs, ways of working, are either somehow reinforced or put into question, right, with a changing environment. And so I became more and more curious about that particularly, and decided to investigate a bit more. But and then my first profession was actually in the field of HR and L&D, but it's easier to look at it retrospectively, right? I think it was what's his name? Name escapes me now, but someone who said you can only connect the dot backwards, right? There was this sentence that I had heard, and I think it was the case for me. It makes sense now, but at the time I had no clue what to do with my business degree. And so the director of my business school, after creating the school and leading it for 10 years, decided to become an entrepreneur. And he decided to hire me with my fresh degree, and so which was probably the first business mistake that he ever made then. And what I observed then was that he actually went from being probably the top psychological authority in my life at the time. I mean, he was literally a brilliant individual, very intelligent man, revered by all the students in the school. And I had, the unique chance to work with him. And in about 15 months, he went from being the director of that business school to being an entrepreneur and, leveraging the love money at the time, back in, late 90s. So full on startup mode, and actually went bankrupt in 15 months. And it was disastrous to see that. So, make a long story short, 15 months after my graduation, I learned two business lessons. One, the difference between business success and failure is very thin. There's a very fine line there. And the second thing was, wow, this guy was so bright. So if intelligence is not sufficient to succeed in business, then what else does it take? And this is the question that I've been working on for 23 years. I joined a coaching and training boutique at the time, shortly after that experience. Loved it, stayed there for 4 or 5 years, and then decided, okay, I want to broaden my portfolio of services and not just address, human problems by, hey, we have a training for that, but looking more broadly, what's happening before training, selection systems, development, performance management, succession after, etc. So broaden the scope of services and also broaden the horizon. I was working for sort of a Franco-French organization, and so I was looking for more of an international scene. That's how I joined DDI and then PDI, and it's been 23 years now. So that's how what drew me to the profession. Now, on the second part of your question about L&D architect, I guess it's about addressing business problems with talent development solutions. So what you've been doing as well, I hear, Victoria, and some of the things in how I approach this particular role have evolved over time. I think when I started in the profession, I cared mostly about, okay, there's got to be great content. If we don't have great content, the training itself, that's not going to work. And today, I tend to look more at it like an ecosystem. I mean, there's considerable research out there looking at the key ingredients of learning transfer. And when you look into the research, you realize that yes, there's a lot that's happening in the training room, with the trainer, the facilitator, the participants, etc. But the person who's actually is going to have the most importance on the learning transfer and the applicability and the result of a training, of a learning and development initiative, is actually the manager. So how do we actually involve the manager before the intervention and after the intervention? And so I've been looking at, building learning and development solutions from probably a more holistic and apparently more effective way as well.
Oh my gosh, do I have a story for you? And that you just like set me up. I didn't even realize it till you just set me up. So I wanted to like chat real quick about DDI because we both worked there, even though we didn't overlap. But the point you shared about how manager support is the number one predictor of training effectiveness and obtaining learning outcomes. I learned that at DDI. It was like 100 years or something of like data and research, or 40, I think it was 40 years. It felt like 100 the way they marketed it, but 40 years of like research showing that the number one thing that leads to training success is manager support more than any other factor. And so I built, while I was there, I was an intern. I built what I call the manager optimization toolkit. And
Wow.
I all but broke Qualtrics to turn it into like a automatic triggering data collection conversation nudging system. So you would take training, you'd go into this like link, it was actually a Qualtrics survey, you'd enter your email and your manager's email, and then you'd each get an email and say, all right, here's your next conversation. And that conversation, you'd enter another link and it would like follow your data a long time. And so like I was trying to like get these conversations to happen using technology. Now, I don't think it went anywhere. But I remember we demoed it to one of their clients and they were like, this is so innovative and cool. And so that manager support piece, like I learned that from DDI. I tried to like help be part of the solution to that problem at DDI. I love it. So did you spend time in Pittsburgh while you were at DDI?
Yeah, I went there a couple of times. So we had at the time this great, annual offsite called PIP. I don't know if it's still
Yes, I missed
with
that. I was like
partners.
right after
Oh,
the PIP days ended.
okay.
I heard stories though. Consultants are fun. It's a fun industry, but I'll
Oh,
just leave it at that. But I
oh
heard
yeah.
that it was a
Oh
great
yeah.
time. Would you
Absolutely.
validate that?
Oh, absolutely. Wonderful time. The A bit of an advertising here for the Nemacolin Woodland Resorts, which is I
Ooh,
think an hour, 2 hours north of Pittsburgh.
fancy. Nemacolin's
Absolutely
fancy.
and being with the community was just the highlight of the year for every DDI out there. Yeah.
Oh, even so, shout out to Scott Wolf. I'm not sure if he was a DDI forever. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he got this for the team one year, and it says
Oh, nice.
inspired on one side, and then it says productivity on the other side. You need the balance, and you need to like
Nice.
yeah, he's wonderful.
Beautiful.
I love my time at DDI, and that was very informative to the work that I do today. If it wasn't for my time at DDI, I wouldn't have ended up in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. I have a lot to thank to, you mentioned Bill Byam, the founder. Well, his daughter, Tacey Byam,
Tasty.
is the
Absolutely.
CEO.
Yeah.
And I came to DDI from Amazon. To go from Amazon at the time, the whole C-suite was male aside from CHRO, outside the business. And I hate that delineation, David. I hate the outside the business delineation. But to go from Amazon to then DDI, where Tacey even came down and shared the vision of the business during that part of onboarding. I'm like, what a cool space to be in. And I don't know, I digress. So I love that we're shared DDI alum. That's very cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was very lucky to spend a few years with that organization. Great memory.
Absolutely. So a couple quick call outs, and I do have a couple more questions for you as well. But for those tuning in live, you can ask questions live. That's the cool thing about us doing this. So be sure to use the comment box, whether you're watching on LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube, and ask David some questions while we have him here. It'd be great to answer your questions. So I have a couple questions left, and these episodes just fly by. I could just talk to like smart, interesting, people, talent, leaders, IOs all day. So anyway, I digress. Okay. So next question. Getting really to the core of what this episode is about, which is economic uncertainty, right? And so it's likely that a lot of employees right now across industries are feeling the effects of economic uncertainty. And even industries that used to feel immune. I think about all the layoffs in tech over the last year, like who would have saw that coming? So anyway, from your perspective, David, what people strategies should organizations be revisiting given these turbulent, uncertain times?
Right. And so this is the the actual research that I've been conducting for these Trend 7, right? As part of the top 10 work trends that have been identified by SIOP for 2023. And I think there are a number of things that stood out, from the different bodies of research I've collected, Q1, Q2, and Q3. The first thing I think we need to recognize in this, in terms of uncertainty, is that for many people out there, what this time has meant is the certainty of losing their job, right? And so I think the HR profession and organizational psychologists definitely have a voice and have a contribution to play there, right? From looking at, making sure that every employee out there is being treated fairly, with fairness, right, and fairly. So a fact-based approach, right, a data-driven approach to making these people decisions is more important than ever. When it comes to layoffs, as you mentioned, in high tech and other sectors, we've seen, massive numbers of employees being laid off since the beginning of the year. I think there's really an opportunity there to work jointly with key decision makers in the business to make sure that we're looking at the right approach when we make that decision. Also, when we announce difficult decision, which is something that's not always done well. It requires a very specific, very refined approach to this very difficult, very sensitive situations. And so, I think there's a lot of you might say duty of care that I think the HR profession has been focused on, and on which they need to double down right now. So supporting leaders in making these difficult decisions, announcing these difficult decisions with humanity, providing a lot of care of the individuals leaving as well as the individuals staying, because the ecosystem changes and is affected dramatically. So that's one of the things that actually came out from the research. Another theme that really stood out is what we've seen, through the pandemic, is the fact that the employee experience has been reshuffled, and in fact, our experience of work has been reshuffled, right? Maybe sometimes against our will. Many of us have been caught by surprise, but I think we've got to recognize that things have worked out pretty effectively, right? We've been able to maintain a high, effective level of business productivity. And so I think, coming out of that, we've seen that, a lot of employees got attached to these new ways of working, right? And enjoyed working from home, reducing the commute time, having more time at home with their loved ones, etc. And whether that's, a trend that's going to stay or not, it's difficult to say. The different, aspects of the research saying different things there. So who knows what the future will bring. But I think in the meantime, there's also an opportunity for organizations, for HR and organizational psychologists, to think about how to reconsider the employee experience. I think this notion of well-being has taken more of a priority. So how do we actually re-articulate the value proposition around, how do we want, what type of work experience do we want to provide as an organization, right? And we need to have, again, a refined approach to this, because, a lot of employees might say, okay, well, how many days am I allowed to work from home? Only 2 days per week? Okay, well, I'll go next door because I'll get 3 days working from home, right? And I think organizations are to tune into these preferences. I think that's very important. At the same time, we also need to recognize that these are only, one could say, material aspects of the role. And one paramount question is also, when people are actually working, in our premises, what type of experience do we actually want to provide there, right? What's a good reason for people to come back to the office? I think organizations have had to think harder and work harder at articulating a more, or rejuvenating, refreshing, a more compelling value proposition on that particular aspect. So it's broad, right? It's quite vast, but I think the employee experience is something to rethink. Another thing that came out from the research is this notion of upskilling. The world changes very rapidly. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. So how do we, and obviously through digitalization, how do we help our people upskill themselves, for the new aspects of a job, of a particular role. One of the things that I've not seen emphasized, maybe as much as I would have thought, is this notion of uncertainty, right? As human beings, we are creature of habits. And these are certainly very difficult and challenging times for many, many of us, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen, next quarter or even next week, etc. And so um, we need to get better at maneuvering times like this, right? And I think one of the ways we typically get better at things as human beings is through practice. So, as counterintuitive as it may seem, I think organizations and teams need to be maybe more proactive at helping individuals, leaders, and teams not just survive through uncertainty, but also better navigate through that environment and anticipate and maybe thrive, dare I say, in uncertainty. I'll take just a very brief example. Um, you take, and I'm happy to be proven wrong on this podcast, but a lot of the organizational development programs that I see these days, or you could take any project, it doesn't have to be learning and development related, but a lot of the projects that I see designed in organizations are very linear, right? And I think there's a risk there of not paying enough attention to having a program that doesn't resemble the actual external world that's out there. So in other words, if you're building an organizational development program, where is the element of surprise? How do you weave in that element of uncertainty, which is completely paramount in the business world, but when you go back to the training room, everything feels, linear, predictable. I think there's a bit of a disconnect there. And I think as part of the trends that organizations should look at to consider, helping organization teams and individuals become better at maneuvering this uncertainty, I think that there might be, and I don't know how to approach it quite yet, but I think there's an opportunity there to expose ourselves with more uncertainty, because that's how we're going to get better at this. I mean, if COVID hits again, pardon the analogy, I'm going to be better off the second time because I've been through the experience before, right? And so, what are the disruptions that we can proactively create in our own lives, in our own teams, in our own organizations, as counterintuitive as it may be, to help us get more and more exposure and become more familiar and also better equipped to maneuver through times like this? That's something that I haven't heard a lot about lately, and that's a bit of a concern, or maybe an opportunity.
Yeah. I want to come back to that, which is like a great segue into our last question. But I also just wanted to pull out and highlight the quote that you shared earlier that I think was super, super relevant to everything you just shared in your previous answer, which is all those points you made, the areas to focus on, came directly from the data and from the research, right? And so even though David, you're not an official IO, you're doing the IO work. I feel like this is just so much of the value that the field of IO psychology brings to HR and business in general, is that we take the data, which is essentially what has happened in the past, right? And we use those data to understand not just what's even only happening right now, but what to focus on in the future. So I just wanted to call that out. I know Steve Jobs is rough around the edges in some ways, but he's very inspirational to me as an entrepreneur and a business leader. So absolutely. I just wanted to call that out. But okay. So we do have one more question, and we're already bumping up on time, which is wild. I feel like we could have separate podcasts for like all those examples you just gave, but there's two things I wanted to highlight specifically. So first off, you called out like it shouldn't just be organizational leaders' responsibility to help employees deal with uncertainty, but to also strengthen our resilience to handle it moving forward. Like a term I think is so old school, and I don't know if you've heard this in like your past companies you've worked in, but VUCA, I think it's so like, even though it's supposed to describe, what does it stand for? It's like
Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, I think. Yeah.
And ambiguity. How do you pronounce it?
VUCA.
I know,
Ambiguity.
ambiguity. I like ambiguity so much more than ambiguity. I think American English could use some classing up, but I digress. Okay, so VUCA, right? Like everything is VUCA. Life is just VUCA. Like we swim in the water of VUCA. Like that's just how the world is. And so instead of like using this as like, hey, we live in a VUCA society and we need to like handle this, we just need to assume that everything is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? And then how do we help ourselves build the resilience, strengthen our muscles to deal with the fact that this is the status quo? It is. And a big part of that is something else you mentioned, which is the resilience piece and the resilience specific to well-being, right? We can't build resilience if we don't even have our basic needs met. And well-being, I think, you brought up COVID. It's another great example of how COVID really shed the spotlight on the importance of well-being, whether it's physical, mental health, emotional health, just having basic resources you need to be able to function. We can't show up to our job and do our best if we don't have our basic needs met. And we can't then develop resilience to living in this, ambiguous, this uncertain environment unless we have I know. So in IO, we poo-poo on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We do. There's not evidence around it. And I get it. If we can't prove it with evidence or gather evidence to support it, I get it. But like, I just feel like there's so much anecdotal truth to it. Like if you don't have your basic needs met, you can't start elevating to those next levels. And resiliency is the next level. And so all this is to say, how can organizational leaders proactively support the well-being of their employees at this time and moving forward? I feel like you've already spoke to a lot of these examples, but like, what would you say for those organizational leaders tuning in? Like, okay, David, what should I start with now? What would you say?
I think 2 or 3 points come to mind. The first one is when we consider the topic of well-being, I think an organization brings the intellectual rigor that we talked about earlier on this podcast about, what does well-being means for us? Let's define it. And if we take it seriously, then we're going to bring the same intellectual rigor that we'll put into our business KPIs. So let's define it, let's assess it, and let's make sure that we work on optimizing these items. And a lot of organizations are working on that right now. 2 other things that come to mind, which I think tend to be a bit neglected these days. One is, you talked about the organizational leadership, right? And one of the ways, there are many definitions out there, but one of the ways I describe leadership is almost like a geometric translation, right? Leadership is this idea that we're going from place A to place B, right? And we're walking there together. As a leader, the premise, or for the team, the premise is that point B should be a better place than point A. Otherwise, why go there in the first place, right? And so point B should actually provide me with, more well-being, essentially. And I think that's the first condition for that is for any leader out there, to your question, Victoria, to have a project for a team. I see many individuals wanting to become leaders because that's the sort of the natural career progression. But it becomes very complex to lead a team if you don't exactly know where you're going. And I'm hearing and seeing a lot of KPIs and Excel spreadsheets about, next year we want to increase our sales by 1%. I'm sorry, that's not a project. That's not something that's going to be, exciting enough, I think, right? It might be a step to a greater project. But so I think the dimension that I'm hearing less of in organization these days that I think we need to bring back. This is a time that calls for bolder approaches, if I may. And so aspects around, what is the dream that the leader is proposing to the team? Where is the sense of I never hear talking about dreams in organizations anymore. Why is that? Where is the desire in organization? Where is the excitement, right? One of the things that I've observed when organizations talk about objective setting, oh yeah, it's got to be SMART. Okay, SMART is an acronym, right? Specific, measurable. I agree with all of that. But what I've seen in organizations, how that translates into is that it becomes a compliance conversation about making sure that the objectives fit into this SMART. There's no longer any sense of excitement about, hey, we're hitting January soon. What could be a great year for you next year? What would you like to accomplish? Where is that conversation? So I think there's an opportunity when we talk about well-being. I mean, just, anybody on the podcast today, think about how you feel, how you act when you're actually following a particular project that you've defined for yourself in your life and a sense of excitement in doing that, as opposed to being forced to do something that you're not really excited about in your personal life, like course that you have to complete, but that you're not really enjoying, right? I mean, we can tell it's palpable. We're a lot more excited when we are chasing something that we feel truly excited about, and so there's an opportunity there. I think we're going to be able to provide more well-being in organizations when we have a compelling project, a compelling vision or dream to propose. And I think that's something that I think has been missing lately. The other aspect is what type of environment do you create? Because the rest of the work after that for the leader is about, and for the team, is reducing the gap between that dream and the reality we're in right now, right? Getting closer and closer to the dream. I think what also is absolutely essential in creating this sense of well-being is the day-to-day experience, right? I would invite a lot of leaders out there to stop managing on Excel spreadsheet, on KPIs, and on the result only, and actually work closely with their team to work on the basics of the role, on the actual gestures that are part of this role, whether you are, a salesperson, whether you are, a nurse, any profession. What are the key essentials, the basic actions that you need to master in this role? And I would double down on that with feedback, with positive reinforcement, with coaching. That's what's going to make the day to day work experience more enjoyable. And that's going to have a profound impact on well being. I'll just finish with one point. I think there's a fallacy out there, a misconception, Victoria, that a great project or that any great human project requires great effort. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think
Mm.
it has more to do with the focus we put into the day-to-day details and mastering a specific aspect of a sales process, for example, right? To the importance of smiling before picking up the phone, because that person is going to notice that, and that should happen before. So some of these basics in professions out there, who are used to spend time on the phone, for example. And so I think it takes more attention to details, and I think that's also part of the equation that we can propose in terms of well-being for organization. One that's going to require maybe less effort, if I may be provocative, more fun, more well-being, less stress. I think that's a better way to higher well-being and stronger business performance.
I am sorry, I just need to put that in the comments. So you said less effort and stress, more fun,
More pleasure,
well-being.
more pleasure of mastering a craft, because any profession out there is a craft. You don't need to be a surgeon doing open heart surgery, right? Any profession out there has a certain skill set that the leader should help to. I mean, if your leader comes to you and is not excited about your job, that's not going to work, right? I mean, sharing the passion, helping the individual see the true value, the true meaning of the profession, through accomplishing the details of that particular job and activity. Uh, I think that's a missed opportunity there. So, and I think that's a huge part of people's well-being in the workplace.
I totally agree. And like, what a great, I was smirking when you were talking about digging into the nitty gritty of the role and those details and like those, what you need to do to work towards that mastery. And I'm like, sounds like a job analysis to me. So those IOs out there, that I know that really resonates with y'all. But this just kills me because we are out of time. We are over time
Already.
because this has been such an amazing conversation, David. So I'm so grateful for you for spending this time with us today. I really hope that if for those out there who've enjoyed this conversation today and want to continue learning about the science and practice of IO psychology, and you don't identify as an IO psychologist, consider joining as a SIOP affiliate, and you get to learn fun facts like how we call it SIOP, but we also get to interact with amazing people like David. And so thank you again for just taking the time to join us here today on behalf of SIOP and all of our listeners out there. We really appreciate the engaging and enlightening conversation and just taking the time to share your experience and brilliance with us, David. So thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to SIOP.
Absolutely. And please join us for those tuning in to our next episode. We'll be live on November 16th at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to talking with you again soon. And until next time, take care.